South Africa's land reform policy remains highly contested. The Department of Agricultural Economics at Stellenbosch University and Agbiz published an essay debunking 5 myths about farming and land reform in South Africa. Prof. Johann, Kirsten and Wandile Sihlobo shed some light on this in today's episode of Plaas TV. But before we get to that, here's Lisa with the latest agricultural news.
Communique exists to serve feed and food producers.
In die nuus vandag, Suid-Afrikaanse wynprodusente verwag 'n goeie maar effe kleiner 2023 wynoes na 'n gesonde maar droë seisoen. So sê die eerste van 4 wynoeskattinge wat jaarliks deur wingerdboukundiges en produsentekellers uitgereik word. Die netto-afname in die skatting word hoofsaaklik toegeskryf aan 'n droër seisoen in al die groeistreke behalwe vir die Noord-Kaap, wat sy eie moeilike omgewingstoestande tydens en na die oes gehad het. Swak blom en set in verskeie gebiede saam met die uitkap van wingerde het ook bygedra tot die afname in die skatting. Luke Gibbs is onlangs as die melkprodusenteorganisasie se nasionale voorsitter verkies, terwyl Niels Neethling as ondervoorsitter aangewys is. Gibbs volg vir Colin Beloved op, wat die afgelope 3 jaar as voorsitter van die MPO gedien het. Zola Gibeda, die voormalige ondervoorsitter, bly aan as 'n lid van die nasionale direksie, sowel as voorsitter van die MPO Oos-Kaap. And the owner of Redlands Farm, Roy Braithwaite from Escort in KwaZulu-Natal, has been fined over 1.7 million rand by the Department of Water and Sanitation for illegally abstracting water from Wagendrug Dam to irrigate his crops. This was apparently done without a water use license. This is according to the South African Government News Agency. The dam, which falls under the Bushman's River Government Water Scheme in the Pongola-Mtamvuma Catchment Management Area, provides water for domestic water supply, agriculture and industrial demands. According to the report, the farmer was found to have contravened Section 21 of the Water Act after the department uncovered an abstraction point on the bank of a dam with no flow meter. And that's today's news.
Communique exists to serve feed and food producers.
South Africa's land reform policy remains highly contested, but according to an article by Wandile Sihlobo and Professor Johann Kirsten, a number of persistent myths about farmland statistics and the structure of commercial agriculture skew debates. This makes it difficult to reach some common understanding about the realities of land and agriculture in the country. To talk to us about this, we would like to welcome Professor Johann Kirsten and Wandile Sihlobo. Prof, what was the reason behind preparing the article?
Yeah, sometimes when you've been long into the academic world, in the agricultural world, you get tired of people debating issues of agriculture and land reform without the proper facts in mind, and this has been going around, and the more we write about this and the more we submit the information into planning debates and into the presidential land reform plan and write it in documents and articles, the more it does not are taken up seriously. So, and when I get into debates, you have the standard facts that are on the table, which is so skewed and so misrepresented that it generates an alternative ideology and an alternative argument around land and agriculture, which is so naive and so problematic, to say the least, and that takes us away from the core issues of agriculture. So I think that was the sort of motive behind this. And Wandile was so kind to add these little arguments around this as well.
Wandile, would you like to add?
I would add there and say, I mean, what Prof has already touched is also essential. We are now at the end of the year. There's a lot of conferences, ANC and the others are debating this issue of land. And I think what the article contributes, as Prof rightly put it, is really to place down on a table the key facts as we all see them. Then we can all, as South African, move from common understanding of the land patterns when we begin to have a debate. But now we move from varied beliefs and views. And I think that ends up to this problematic discussion when we debate about land. But I think once now we've established the baseline, then we can test different policy proposition, different programs, and see how we move. That's, I think, in my view, the contribution of this article to the debate.
The article lists 5 myths. Prof, would you care to discuss the first 2? And I'd like to read them. 40,000 white farmers own 80% of all South Africa's land. And the second one, commercial agriculture is characterized by large-scale white farmers.
Okay, so there are a number of contentious issues here. First of all, the number of 40,000 is the magic number that everybody quotes. And that, unfortunately, is coming from the agricultural census of 2017, which states the number of 40,122 farmers that they have in the census. But the reality is that the basis for that census is only the business register of SARS, meaning those farmers that are registered for VAT. And you can only register for VAT when you have a turnover of 1 million and more. Previously it was 500,000, but nowadays it's 1 million and more, and you find it quite difficult to register for VAT if you don't reach that threshold. So that's the point. So that means that we exclude probably quite a number of farmers that are commercial, but are not in the VAT register. And Wandile, through his interaction with Stats SA, being on the Stats SA board, were able to get us data from the population census and also from the community survey of 2016, which help us to identify households that as agriculture as their first source of income and their second source of income. And so my argument, and Wandile supports me there, if I'm not mistaken, that all farmers that sell anything are commercial. And if you then unpack the second myth, is that many of the farmers are small scale. All of the, about 90% of the VAT paying farmers and those that are not even paying VAT are all family-based small operations, which is a fact that nobody appreciates. There are only 2,700 farmers in the large-scale category, which earns a revenue of turnover of more than 22.5 million. So the related point is that you have so many farmers who are just talking about the 40,000 is problematic. And then the other mistake that people make is that the myth says 80% of all land. Now, if you think South Africa has 122 million hectares, a large chunk of that is already in the former homelands, in the South African Development Trust. And if you then get to farmland that is in private hands, in private title deeds, so it's surveyed and registered with the deeds office, then you get to 77.8 million or 70.5 million hectares. And if you then take the land reform progress that we've made and you take the ownership by white farmers, then you get to 61 million hectares, and that is 78% of freehold farmland. So if people say 80%, it should be for freehold farmland, but 50% of South Africa. So that's the clarification we wanted to make. And then also, the race issue is also problematic. Our best guess is that in the 40,000 number that people quote around, there's at least 2,700 black operators, which then also complicate the argument in saying that all white farmers are 40,000 and they all own 80% of South Africa. So that's the broader complication of that. But linked to the numbers of farmers is in the scale. We often let people confuse the scale with the race of the operator. And that is something that we need to highlight and say that all farmers are small scale. It's not the land that they operate, it's the scale of the business. It's the size of the business, and the size of the business is the turnover. It's not the land. And we can't get that into the minds of people. They all think small scale is either black or small scale is either small land. And that's why the political ideology, the policy documents all talk about small scale as if they only refer to black farmers. And that's the point we're trying to make, is that small scale is all farmers. And that's why the policy prescriptions become then problematic, because now you say that policy should be directed at small scale. So then my question is it small scale white or small scale black, small scale colored, or all small scale farmers? Then you see the government run in circles because they've created their own trap by categorizing farmers unnecessarily.
Wandile, your comment?
I think what I would add on what Prof said, I mean, if policymakers want to say a particular program is targeting black farmers, they should say so. And not say smallholder farmers. I think if you say, look, this is an empowerment program, it's for black farmers, write it down and put it in that way. Because the semantics of saying no smallholder farmers because you don't want to be explicit, it ends up being unhelpful and creating ambiguity. And also you're not able to measure what you are doing. So I think we should get to that level of comfort and be clear about what we mean, which is what the two myths that Prof have outlined attempts to do. The other point I would add there to emphasize, in fact, is that on that 40,000 that Prof is talking about, it's also important to emphasize the fact that those are farming units. It may be slightly less individuals or slightly more individual, but it's farming units, not the individual persons that are there.
Yeah, and so that becomes a critical issue for you in the media, because you in the media wants to count the number of potential readers, but you won't get it from that number as well. But I think Wandile's point now about being less ambiguous about what you mean is probably the main point that we're trying to get across.
Wandile, would you elaborate on the following two, please? Myth number 3, commercial farmers are hoarding land and not selling any farms. Number 4, all black farmers with private title deeds acquired their land through the land reform program.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the myth about hoarding land, in part, it's what has fueled even the debate from 2017 or so about expropriation without compensation. Because what one finds when engaging to some of these debates is that some amongst us believe that farmers do not want to sell the land. They are buying stock land and keeping it to themselves, leading to these disparities of the land ownership. And therefore, the only way to actually really be able to access this land is by expropriating it, because nothing is available in the market. That's the popular belief that is out there. But what we found when we looked at the numbers, particularly focused on the deeds office, is that there's actually quite a lot of transactions. And in fact, you look back from the early 2000s up until now, you find that each year there's usually between 2,000 or 4,000 farms that are available for sale. So anyone who really wants to buy a farm can be able to access some from those farms that are in there. So the idea that there is hoarding and not enough sellers in the market to the extent that we may have to force people through expropriation is not quite what we find when we look at the deeds registers numbers. That's the one myth. But of course, then you quickly look into what's going on with myth 4, which says about all black farmers have largely benefited on land reform and not gone out to buy land by themselves. when we looked at that in the data, we find that there's also quite a lot of problematic things with that statistics, because nearly 2 million hectares have actually been purchased by black farmers on their own steam, without actually being the land reform side. And that's quite sizable, because it's about 2.3% of South Africa's farmland. So it's quite a sizable size. So the clarification or the addition that we bring then to the debate is that black farmers have gone to the market, are buying land by themselves, but they can assist through effective land reform program. And also the fact that there is quite some liquidity in the land market, with between 2,000 and 4,000 farms that are being sold annually, and one can tap into those.
Prof, any comments from you?
Yeah, just to add a little bit of statistic to and color in the point about land sales. If you look at the number of transactions that he mentioned in 2021, there were 2,580 farms that were sold, and more than half of them are farms smaller than 300 hectares, which suggests to you that it's not impossible for anybody that want to start a business to buy land at affordable prices. So sometimes smaller lands are more expensive, but if you think about grain and pasture land and extensive farms, that's category, then it's possible to buy. But the more substantive point that talks to the two myths is that if we had proper finance in place for black farmers to access the land market, we would have had more black farmers buying land. And the argument here is that white farmers in the 1930s and 1950s acquired land through the land bank at preferential terms. They had subsidized interest rate, long-term period for repayment, sort of a payment holiday in the first 5 years. And those things are not in place now, because the land bank had to acquire funding in the capital market, which is expensive. And whereas the previous regime subsidized the land bank and allowed them to be able to lend out money at 2% or whatever the case might be. So our financial arrangements is not supporting the land reform process. And then this is a private-driven land reform process. We argue that if black owners of land materializes, we per definition have transfer of land to black people, which is part of that process to get equitable ownership of land. So I think just to add the argument around finance, that could have added much more to those numbers that we have in place there.
And now for the final one, Prof, myth number 5. South Africa has only redistributed 8% of farmland to black people.
Yeah, okay, so the mistake people make here is that they forget that there are a number of pillars of land reform. We obviously are doing nothing substantively in terms of upgrading of land tenure in the former homelands. That is something that is still backing, but if you look at the restitution, redistribution, and you add the private purchases that we've just discussed, and you've added the acquisition of farmland by government, then the numbers tally up. Because what we're now saying is that we should not talk only about redistribution to black individuals, but we should talk about land that was previously owned by white farmers that are not owned by white farmers anymore. So government acquired 2.5 million hectares through the proactive land acquisition strategy since 2006. So that's already a substantive number. Government acquired more than 500,000 hectares of land for non-farm use, probably development, for roads, for dams, for new neighborhoods, etc. The private purchase that we just talked about is 1.8. Then through the redistribution program, there are some that go into farm use and some that go into non-farm use, but it was farmland that was transferred into the hands of black people through the redistribution program. That's 7.3 million hectares. And then the restitution program gave land back to individuals and communities that were forcibly removed from their land during the apartheid years. That's a total of almost 4 million hectares. And that adds up to 16 million hectares, which is roughly 20% of the freehold farmland. 20% of the freehold farmland, which is away from white ownership in 1994. Then the restitution program also allows the individuals and communities to elect for financial compensation instead of ownership of the land. They say, oh, we're not going to farm, or that land has been taken up by estates or whatever. So if you take that compensation money and transfer that into hectares, it's 2.5 million. So 2.5 million hectares of land previously confiscated from black people, owned by white people, and still owned by white people or community or government or whatever, is already been restored. So in essence, we are at 18.6 million hectares, which is 24% of 77 million, which is a different number that has been beating around the bush, and which is going to be interesting to see if Wandile's Letulea's people are going to listen to that number and believe the number.
Wandile, your comment very briefly.
I think what our Prof has outlined in as far as our progress is quite encouraging. And in a way, I would say the government is not taking enough credit for what it has done. Punting on a less appealing number is actually underestimating the efforts that have been made. But of course, to the point that Prof was relating to, that on tenure reform, we have made minimal progress. And I think that's what mirrors even the frustration in society, because if you tell somebody that we are at 23%, 24% progress, and they are not seeing the economic benefit, that looks illusionary. But I think if we had done then a progress on transferring long-term tradable title deeds, long-term tradable leases, title deeds and stuff, and then make sure that there are allocations that go to the land bank supports all of the new entrance farmers, then there will be more activity and people would see the economic benefit of all of that. And I think these are things, as we go forward, we have to be thinking about them along with the land reform agency that the president and the minister have talked about, to say, how do we move then from this article to build a sustainable, sound footing for our land reform program.
Wandile, in closing, what would you like to achieve with the article? What is your next step?
I mean, we wrote the article as academics at the University of Stellenbosch, and our attempt there is only to just say, these are the facts as we observe them from the data. Then those that are elected and those that are lobbying for other things, let at least move from this neutral basis as we begin to talk about our land reform, whatever side of the ideology or whatever side of the policy framework you come from, but this is the base. Then let's all establish and move in there. But our aspiration is, of course, a sustainable way of land reform, sustainable way of agricultural finance, as what I was alluding to.
Professor Johann, Kirsten and Wandile Sihlobo on an article they compiled recently about South Africa's land reform policy.
Syngenta, bringing plant potential to life.
Hierdie week wil ons graag kyk na die rand teenoor die Amerikaanse dollar en ons kan sien dat hierdie stygende kanaal steeds in plek is. Tans omtrent sedert die week van die 7de November 2022 bly die rand met hierdie onderste band flankeer. En hierdie stygende kanaal is tans bevestig solank as R17.45 'n weerstand bly. Die volle teiken van die rand, indien hierdie volle kanaal sou uitspeel, is die wyte van die kanaal afgeprojekteer van die plek waar hy bevestig is, wat beteken ons kan die rand terugsien rondom R16.05 sou die momentum na onder voortduur. Die sterk steun op die rand wag natuurlik by hierdie vlakkie van R17.07 en sou daardie vlak in 'n weerstand verander, sien ons dat daar 'n inverse koppie en piering formasie is, wat beteken dat onder hierdie neckline van R17.07 kan die volle teiken van hierdie formasie van die omgekeerde koppie en handvatsel formasie die rand terugvat na 15.52. Die langtermyn sentiment meter, daardie 40 week bewegende gemiddeld, is steeds 'n steun, wat beteken my 3 maande plus siening op die rand is steeds 'n swakker rand teenoor die Amerikaanse dollar, maar my formasie sê vir my dat ek dalk in die korter termyn eerder 'n sterker rand verwag. My stochasties is hier by 24, beide lyne in my stochasties wys steeds afwaarts, wat vir my sê dat die momentum na onder is steeds in plek, solank daar die R17.50 'n weerstand bly. Bo R17.50 kan ons natuurlik weer 'n swakker rand verwag, wat ons terug kan vat na 18 vlakke rondom R18.52, sou die momentum na bo voortduur.
Syngenta, bringing plant potential to life.
Ons stel bekend die nuwe, sterker as ooit tevore, 165 kW Hilux GR Sport.
BKB, die betroubare tuiste van landbou. BKB, the trusted home of agriculture. Elanco, we are driven by our vision of food and companionship enriching life.